There are some discoveries that change everything before you even understand what you're looking at. Sienna Cross was 17 years old when she found the photograph, and for the rest of her life, she would remember exactly how the late afternoon light fell across her father's study that day. Gold and heavy, the kind that makes ordinary rooms look like something out of a painting. She remembered the smell of the space, old paper, cedar wood, and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco her father had given up years before she was born. She remembered the Persian rug beneath her feet, burgundy and navy, its edges worn soft from decades of footsteps. She remembered all of it, because the mind tends to brand the moments that split your life into before and after. She had only gone in to borrow a pen. Her father, Dr. Leonard Cross, was a careful man, careful with his words, careful with his money, careful with his past. His study reflected that carefulness. Books, arranged by subject, then alphabetically within each subject. Files labeled and color-coded. A desk so neat it barely looked used. Sienna had grown up respecting the invisible boundary around that room the way children learn to respect hot stoves, not because anyone burned her, but because the warning in her father's voice was enough. He wasn't home. He wouldn't be back until evening. She told herself it was only a pen. The leather-bound journal was what caught her eye first. Deep brown, cracked at the spine, sitting at a slight angle on the third shelf from the bottom, as if someone had pulled it recently and replaced it in a hurry. Her father didn't do anything in a hurry. He didn't do anything at an angle. She stood in front of it for a moment, her hand hovering. The rational, rule-following part of her brain offered its usual argument. The other part, the part that had spent years quietly collecting the small strangeness of their household, the hushed phone calls, the locked drawer in the desk, the way her father sometimes looked at her, and her twin sister Mara, with an expression she could never quite name. That part of her brain won. She pulled the journal from the shelf. It fell open in her hands, because something had been tucked inside the front cover, something thick enough to interrupt the spine. A photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed on the left edge, the way photos looked when they were developed at home rather than in a shop. The kind of photograph someone took privately. Sienna's first thought was that she was looking at herself. But that was impossible. The woman in the photograph was older, mid-30s, maybe, dressed in clothing that dated the image somewhere in the early 2000s. Her hair was dark, pulled back from her face in a loose knot. She stood in front of a house Sienna didn't recognize, her arms crossed loosely, not quite smiling. There was something in her expression that sat between confidence and exhaustion, the look of someone who had fought hard for something and wasn't entirely sure they'd won. Sienna turned the photograph over. Blank. No date. No name. Nothing written on the back, except a faint crease where someone's thumb had pressed into it repeatedly, the mark of a person who had held this image many times. She turned it back over and looked again. The woman's eyes were the problem. Dark, wide-set, slightly upturned at the outer corners. Sienna had spent 16 years looking at those eyes in the mirror. She had spent 16 years sitting across the breakfast table from her twin sister Mara, watching those same eyes roll or sparkle, or go flat with boredom. The shape of them was not a coincidence she could explain away. Neither was the particular way the woman's jaw was structured, or the faint asymmetry of her mouth, fuller on the left side than the right, that Mara had always called her trademark, and Sienna had always secretly considered hers. They were looking at the same face, decades apart, but the same face. Sienna's hand developed a tremor she didn't notice until the photograph shook. She pressed it flat between both palms, steadied herself, and looked at the journal still open in her other hand. The pages were dense with her father's handwriting, small, meticulous, the letters barely separating from each other. She didn't let herself read it. Not yet. She was already standing somewhere she hadn't been given permission to stand, holding something she hadn't been given permission to hold. She took a photo of the photograph with her phone. Then she replaced the journal on the shelf, at the same angle she'd found it. She backed out of the study, pulled the door closed behind her, and stood in the hallway with her heart running ahead of her like a dog that had spotted something in the dark. Who was that woman? Her father had no sisters. Her mother, gone since the twins were 4, a car accident on a rain-slicked highway, had been an only child too. That was the story. That was the whole story of their family. Small, contained, ended early. Leonard Cross, 2 daughters, a quiet house, and the understanding that some subjects were not brought to the dinner table. Sienna looked down at the image on her phone screen. The woman looked back. Whatever her father had built this silence around, whatever careful architecture of omission he had constructed across 17 years, there was a face at the center of it. A face with her eyes. A face with Mara's jaw. A face that didn't belong to anyone she had ever been told about, but somehow looked more familiar than almost anyone she knew. She didn't know the woman's name. She didn't know when the photograph was taken, or why her father kept it pressed inside a locked-away journal, or what the connection was between that stranger and the 2 girls her father had raised with such fierce, specific privacy. But Sienna Cross knew one thing with complete certainty. Standing in the hallway of the house, she thought she understood. She was going to find out. If you've ever come across something that made you question everything you thought you knew about your own family, stay with this story, because it's only just beginning. 12 years is a long time to look for someone who doesn't want to be found. Donovan Pierce had learned that early, not from the private investigators he'd hired, not from the dead-end leads that stacked up in a filing cabinet, kept in the corner of his home office, but from the particular quality of silence that follows a person who has made a deliberate choice to disappear. Amara hadn't left in a panic. She hadn't stumbled out of his life the way people do when they're frightened or confused. She had gone with intention, clean, precise, the way she did most things. That was what made it so hard to let go. He knew her well enough to know it wasn't an accident. He was 38 now. When he'd last seen her, he was 26 and standing in the driveway of his father's estate in the rain, watching the taillights of a cab pull away into the dark. He'd told himself, in those first few months, that she would come back. That whatever had happened that night, and the events of that night were something he still couldn't think about without his jaw tightening, she would eventually understand that he hadn't chosen it, that he hadn't known what his father was going to say to her, that he had fought his way down that hallway as fast as he could, and he had still been too slow. She didn't come back. By the end of the first year, he'd hired his first investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Garrett, who came highly recommended and charged accordingly. Garrett found nothing substantial. A forwarding address that led to a post office box in Atlanta, a name on a lease, agreement that stopped being renewed after 8 months, and then nothing. She had learned, somewhere in those early months, how to move without leaving much of a trail. The second investigator was better. She tracked Amara to a small city in North Carolina, confirmed a sighting, confirmed employment at a legal firm, sent Donovan a photograph taken from across a parking lot. He'd held that photograph for a long time. She looked different, older, obviously, but something else too, more contained, more deliberate in the way she carried herself. He'd told himself she looked well. He'd told himself that was enough. It wasn't enough. He'd flown to North Carolina 3 weeks later, and she was already gone. Whatever instinct had helped her survive those early years had apparently kept working on her behalf. He wondered sometimes if she knew he was looking. He wondered if that was part of why she kept moving. By year 5, he had accepted, not peacefully, not without cost, that finding her was not the same as fixing what had happened. Even if Garrett or one of the others eventually placed her in a room with a fixed address and a stable phone number, Donovan was not naive enough to think that a decade of silence could be undone by a conversation. He had missed things, the kind of things a person doesn't get back. That thought lived in him like a splinter, not always painful, but always present. He'd thrown himself into Pierce Holdings with the focused energy of a man who needed somewhere to put his grief. The company had grown significantly under his leadership over the past decade, moving from regional real estate investments into a broader portfolio that now included media acquisitions, hospitality infrastructure, and tech development. His board was pleased. His father, Maxwell Pierce, who had moved into an advisory role 4 years ago when his health began declining, occasionally expressed something that might have been pride, though with Maxwell, it was always difficult to separate pride from ownership. The Langston Media merger had been on the table for 8 months. It was a sound deal. Langston was a mid-sized media company with a strong regional footprint, a loyal client base, and an infrastructure that complemented Pierce Holdings' existing acquisitions in 3 key markets. The numbers were clean. The terms were reasonable. Donovan's team had reviewed the proposal twice, and both times the recommendation had come back the same: proceed. The name on the file had been on his desk for 2 weeks before he actually read the full staff directory that accompanied the corporate overview. He'd almost missed it. Amara Jennings, Senior Legal Counsel, Langston Media Group. Donovan had read the line 3 times. Then he'd set the file down, stood up from his desk, walked to the window of his 42nd floor office, and stood there for a long time looking out at the city below without seeing any of it. She had a last name he didn't recognize. She had a title that told him she had built something real in the years he hadn't been able to find her. And she was attached, professionally and contractually, to the single most significant business deal his company was currently pursuing. 12 years of dead ends. 12 years of filing cabinet silence and parking lot photographs and forwarding addresses that led nowhere. And here she was, not found by an investigator, not tracked by a trail she'd accidentally left, but sitting inside a business transaction his own team had brought to him. He didn't believe in coincidence. He never had, but he didn't know what to call this either. Some people spend years searching for closure, only to have fate hand them something far more complicated than they bargained for. Keep watching. Let me tell you something about Donovan Pierce that he would never tell you himself. He is, at his core, a man who believes that love is something you fight for. He has built his entire emotional architecture around that belief: the searching, the investigators, the 12-year vigil he keeps like a man tending a flame he refuses to let go out. It is, in its own way, admirable. Donovan Pierce is the kind of man that stories are written about. I know this because I have spent the better part of 3 years studying him. My name is Cade Langston. My father built Langston Media from a regional print operation into something worth acquiring. And when he died 4 years ago, he left it to me with a list of expectations as long as my arm and a company that was, beneath its tidy exterior, beginning to show its age. The merger with Pierce Holdings was my idea. My board thought I was selling. I told them I was positioning. The distinction matters, but not in the way they understood it. I had known about Amara Jennings for 18 months before my team sent her file to Pierce Holdings. She had come to Langston Media through a contact in our legal division, carrying a resume that was impressive enough to justify the senior counsel position without requiring too many questions about the years that preceded it. She was careful, not in an obvious way, but in the way of someone who has learned that information is a resource to be managed. She didn't volunteer personal history. She didn't attend company social events unless attendance was specifically expected. She was warm with her colleagues, but never intimate, professional at all times, and extraordinarily good at her job. I noticed her within the first 2 weeks. Not romantically, not initially, professionally. The way she handled a contract negotiation with a distribution partner told me more about her than most people reveal in 6 months of close acquaintance. She was precise, yes, but more than that, she understood leverage. She understood that what a person doesn't say in a negotiation matters as much as what they do say. I found that interesting. I found her interesting. It took me another 3 weeks to realize why she looked familiar. I had met Donovan Pierce twice before the merger conversations began. Once at an industry event. Once at a mutual contact's private dinner. We were not friends, but we operated in overlapping circles, and I had paid enough attention to know the broad outline of his personal history. The woman he'd spent a decade looking for. The circumstances that had separated them. His father's involvement. People talk, especially in the kind of rooms where Donovan and I both tend to find ourselves. When I looked at Amara Jennings across the conference table during a routine contract review, I recognized the structure of her face from a photograph I had seen, not the parking lot. Photograph Donovan's investigator had taken, but an older image, a personal one, that had surfaced in a conversation I'd had with someone who knew the Pierce family history far better than I did. I didn't tell her what I knew. That decision was not made carelessly. I understood what I was choosing, or rather, what I was choosing not to do. Amara Jennings had built a life that did not include Donovan Pierce, and she had done so with considerable effort and skill. She was not hiding in the way of someone who is afraid. She was living in the way of someone who has drawn a boundary and intends to keep it. I respected that boundary, in the way that a chess player respects the position of an opponent's piece, as information, not as instruction. The courtship, when it began, was gradual. I am not a man who rushes things. I understood that Amara's trust was not something that could be pursued directly. It had to be made available, and then waited for. I created circumstances. I made sure we were in the same rooms at the right times, that our professional collaboration gave us reasons to work closely, that the quality of my attention was consistent without being pressure. 4 months in, we had dinner for the first time, as something other than colleagues. 8 months in, she had met the small number of people I considered genuine friends. A year in, she had stopped keeping quite so careful a distance. 7 months ago, I asked her to marry me. She said yes. What I have not told her is that the merger with Pierce Holdings, which she knows about professionally, and has begun preparing her legal team to support, will bring Donovan Pierce directly into her world. What I have not told her is that I know who she is to him, and who he has been spending 12 years looking for. What I have not told her is that the engagement she celebrated with her colleagues, the ring she still looks at sometimes like she's reminding herself it's real, and the future she has allowed herself to begin wanting, all of it is built on a foundation she has not been permitted to inspect. I have my reasons. Whether they are good ones is a question I am not yet prepared to answer. What I can tell you is this: Donovan Pierce believes in fighting for love. He is flying into this city in 6 days for the first round of merger negotiations. He does not yet know that the woman listed in our staff directory as Amara Jennings is engaged to the man across the table from him. He does not yet know that I know exactly who she is to him. And Amara, the woman who rebuilt her life with such careful, deliberate hands, does not know that the path she walked away from 12 years ago is about to walk through the same door she walks through every morning. I know all of this. And I have said nothing. The most dangerous people in any story aren't always the ones who act. Sometimes they're the ones who watch and wait and choose exactly the right moment to move. Stay with us. The conference room on the 23rd floor of the Langston Media Building had floor-to-ceiling windows on the north wall, which meant that on a clear morning like this one, the city spread out behind whoever was presenting. All glass and steel and distance. It was the kind of room designed to make deals feel significant. The long table was dark walnut, the chairs leather, the air temperature precisely controlled in the way that expensive buildings manage without anyone ever asking for it. Donovan arrived 7 minutes early. His team, 2 senior associates and his head of acquisitions, Marcus Webb, arranged themselves on one side of the table with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Donovan sat at the center, his jacket on, his notes in front of him, his face carrying the expression his colleagues had learned to read as professional focus. They could not have known it was costing him more than usual to hold it there. He had not slept particularly well. The Langston legal team filed in at 3 minutes to the hour. 4 people, tablet screens lit, folders distributed with the quiet choreography of a team that had prepped thoroughly. He assessed them without appearing to habit, not calculation. Senior associate on the left, cautious, deferred to the woman next to him before she'd said a word. Junior counsel at the end, taking notes before anything had been said, which meant she was nervous. The man directly opposite Marcus relaxed in a way that suggested either confidence or indifference, and Donovan hadn't decided which yet. He was making that assessment when the door at the far end of the room opened again. She came in mid-sentence, speaking quietly to a colleague she held the door for, a small courtesy, automatic, the kind that reveals character more than grand gestures do. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her hair pulled back from her face in a knot that looked effortless and wasn't. She had a leather portfolio tucked under one arm and a phone in her other hand, which she silenced and turned face down the moment she stepped fully into the room. Then she looked up. Her eyes moved across the room with the brisk professional efficiency of someone taking inventory, table layout, team positions, sightlines to the presentation screen. They passed over Donovan without pause, without recognition, without the smallest catch or hesitation, and continued to the empty chair she was clearly headed for. She sat down, opened her portfolio, and uncapped her pen. Donovan realized, distantly, that he hadn't moved in approximately 4 seconds. Marcus said something to him, a question about the opening framework, the kind of low-stakes prompt his head of acquisitions used to re-anchor him when client meetings started with unexpected variables. Donovan answered it. His voice came out level. He was grateful for that. Across the table and 3 seats to the right, Cade Langston had arrived without Donovan registering it, another thing that almost never happened. Cade was watching him with an expression of careful, composed attention, not smiling, not signaling anything, just watching, the way a person watches something they've been waiting a long time to see. The meeting began. The agenda was straightforward, opening statements on both sides, a review of the structural framework Pierce Holdings had submitted in the preliminary proposal, and a preliminary discussion of the legal integration timeline. Amara led the Langston legal response. She was, as her file had suggested, exceptional, concise without being blunt, technically thorough without losing the room, precise in her challenges to the Pierce Holdings timeline in a way that forced 2 genuine revisions to positions Marcus had considered settled. Donovan watched her work. She had always been like this, had always carried that particular combination of warmth and sharpness that made people feel, simultaneously, that they were being taken care of and held to a standard. He had forgotten, somehow, in the abstraction of 12 years and filing cabinets and parking lot photographs, what it actually felt like to be in the same room as her. The photographs had kept her static. The memory had kept her at the age she was when he last saw her. The woman across this table from him was neither of those things. She was fully present, fully formed, fully somewhere else. She did not know him. That fact landed in him differently than he'd expected. He had spent months, in the weeks since finding her name in the directory, preparing himself for various versions of this moment. He had imagined recognition, the complicated, charged thing that might happen when she looked up and saw his face. He had imagined distance, controlled, and professional. He had imagined anger or grief, or any of the 100 emotional registers that 12 years of separation might reasonably produce. He had not fully prepared for this, the particular absence of any of it. The clean, impersonal way her eyes had moved across his face and found nothing there that required a response. By the time the meeting reached its scheduled break point, 2 hours and 14 minutes after it began, the preliminary framework had been agreed upon with 3 notations for follow-up. Donovan's team was satisfied. Cade's team was satisfied. Amara was already speaking quietly with her junior colleague, reviewing something in the portfolio, her attention fully on the work in front of her. Marcus leaned toward Donovan as they gathered their materials. "Good room," he said. "Langston's legal team is sharp. Should make for a clean process." "Yes," Donovan said. He did not look at Amara again as he left the room. He was disciplined enough for that much, at least. What he couldn't discipline himself out of was the question that had taken up permanent residence in the center of his chest somewhere around the 40-minute mark of the meeting, and had not left since. What had happened to her? In 12 years, that had made her look at him as if he were simply a name on the other side of a contract. What would you do if the person you loved most looked right through you like you were a stranger? That question is about to get a lot more complicated. Stay with this story. The Langston estate on the north side of the city was the kind of property that had been built to host events like this one. 3 acres of manicured grounds, a terrace that ran the full length of the back of the house, and a catering team that had been on site since early morning, arranging white floral centerpieces and lighting the kind of lanterns that made everyone inside their glow look slightly more beautiful than they actually were. By 8 o'clock, there were well over 200 guests. Donovan stood near the edge of the terrace with a glass of sparkling water he'd been holding long enough for the condensation to run down his fingers. He had not planned to come. The invitation had arrived through professional channels, a Langston media event, significant enough that his absence would have been read as a statement, and Marcus had flagged it as strategically important to attend. Donovan had agreed because Marcus was right, and because the alternative was sitting in his hotel suite thinking the same four thoughts in rotation. He had not fully considered what it would look like. Amara stood near the center of the terrace in a deep green dress, the kind of color that looked like a decision rather than an accident. She was laughing at something one of the guests had said, genuinely laughing, not the polished social version that people deploy at events like this, but the real kind, brief and unguarded. Cade stood beside her with one hand at the small of her back, and the ease of it, the way she didn't stiffen, the way she leaned slightly toward him without appearing to notice she was doing it, told Donovan everything he needed to know about where she was in her life right now. She was happy. He had not let himself fully account for that possibility. You came. Cade's voice came from his left, unhurried, as if he'd materialized out of the ambient noise of the party without effort. He was holding a glass of champagne and wearing an expression that was almost friendly, the kind of almost that leaves a small, deliberate gap. "Congratulations," Donovan said. He kept his voice even. "It's a considerable event." "She wanted something small," Cade said, glancing back toward Amara. "I convinced her that small wasn't the right word for this occasion." He paused. "She compromised. 240 guests is her version of a compromise." Donovan said nothing. Cade turned back to him, and the almost friendly expression settled into something more precise. "I want to talk to you about something, and I'd prefer to do it here rather than in a conference room. Less documentation." The shift was clean and deliberate. Donovan set his glass down on the stone railing. "I know who she is," Cade said. "Not who she is professionally. I mean who she is to you. Amara Jennings. The woman you've had investigators looking for since you were 26 years old." He let that sit for a moment. "I've known since before the merger conversations began." The terrace noise continued around them, glasses clinking, conversation layering over itself, someone's laughter carrying from the far end near the garden. Donovan kept his face still. "She doesn't know?" he asked. "That you're coming? That Pierce Holdings is the acquiring company? She knows both of those things professionally." Cade's voice remained level. "That you specifically are the reason she left her entire life behind 12 years ago? No. She doesn't know that. And she doesn't know that I know." "Then what is it you want to say to me, Cade?" Cade took a measured sip of his champagne. "She has built something here. It took her a long time, and it cost her considerably, and I'm not going to allow it to be dismantled because you've decided that proximity is the same as an invitation." He turned to face Donovan directly. "The merger closes in 11 weeks. Between now and then, you will conduct yourself as a professional business partner, and nothing more. You will not approach her about your personal history. You will not put her in a position where she has to manage whatever you've spent 12 years feeling. And if I don't agree to that, then I will make the remaining 11 weeks of this merger process considerably more complicated than they need to be. My legal team can introduce delays that are entirely justifiable on paper and that your board will not look favorably on." He said it without heat, without threat in his voice, simply as information. "I have no interest in destroying this deal, but I have considerably more interest in protecting her than I do in completing it." Donovan looked at him for a long moment. Across the terrace, Amara had moved to speak with another group of guests. She tilted her head slightly when she listened. She had always done that, had always given her full attention to whoever was speaking to her in a way that made people feel specifically seen. He thought about his daughters, back home. He thought about Sienna, who was 17 and careful and curious. He thought about Mara, who was 17 and sharp and felt everything at full volume. He thought about what it meant that those two girls existed in the world, and what it would mean for Amara to know it. "She has a right to know," Donovan said quietly. "She has a right to peace," Cade replied, with the certainty of someone who has decided that these two things cannot coexist. Donovan picked up his glass. He took a slow breath. He looked at the woman in the green dress who had laughed genuinely a few minutes ago at something someone had said, who wore the ring on her left hand with the tentative joy of someone still learning to trust good things. He could feel the weight of 11 weeks pressing against the weight of 12 years, and he did not yet know which one would hold. 12 years is long enough to wear the edges off most memories. Not this one. Donovan could reconstruct that night in precise order, the way you can only reconstruct something you have returned to so many times that it has become less a memory and more a record. Every detail fixed and immovable. Every sequence leading to the same ending, no matter how many times you reach the point where you think it might be possible for things to go differently. It had been November. A fund-raising dinner at the Pierce estate. The kind of evening his father organized 4 or 5 times a year, part genuine philanthropy and part the careful, continuous work of maintaining a social position that Maxwell Pierce considered his primary inheritance to protect. 200 guests. A string quartet in the East drawing room. His father moving through the rooms like a man who owned them because he did own them, and because he had never once forgotten it. Amara had been there as Donovan's guest. Not a secret. Not yet, but not quite announced either. He had loved her for almost 2 years by then. The particular, consuming kind of love that a 26-year-old doesn't fully understand they're in until they try to imagine its absence, and find the space simply will not hold the thought. She was in a dark red dress, which he remembered not because he was trying to remember the color, but because when she'd walked into the room earlier that evening, 2 conversations had paused around him without anyone appearing to notice. He had not known that night that she was pregnant. She had known for 4 days. She had been trying to find the right moment to tell him, which was why she was quieter than usual at dinner, which was why she had pressed his hand under the table, twice without explanation, which was why she had excused herself earlier than he'd expected and stepped outside through the French doors at the end of the East Hall. What happened next was reconstructed later, in pieces, from what Amara told him in the 15 minutes they had together after he found her on the terrace, before his father's face appeared in the doorway. Maxwell Pierce had intercepted her in the hallway on the way out. Donovan did not know how his father had known. Maxwell Pierce had a way of knowing things in that house, of reading atmospheres and outcomes the way other people read words on a page. He had walked beside her toward the terrace, very calmly, and he had told her what he knew, that she was carrying his son's child, that his son's engagement to Helena Marsh, an engagement that Donovan had refused, that he had told his father twice, and then 3 times was not happening, had already been informally communicated to the Marsh family because Maxwell did not ask for what he wanted when he could simply arrange it in advance. He had not raised his voice. He had offered her a figure, a number that Donovan, when he finally learned it years later, felt in his stomach like a physical blow, and he had made clear, in the quiet, inflectionless language his father used for things he considered settled matters, that the alternative to accepting it was a prolonged legal and social campaign that Maxwell Pierce had both the resources and the willingness to execute. Then he had gone back inside. Donovan had found her on the terrace, 12 minutes later, which was 12 minutes too late. She had her arms wrapped around herself, and she was looking out at the grounds with an expression he had never seen on her face before, and has never been able to adequately describe since. Something past shock, not quite resolved into a decision, standing exactly at the point where a person determines whether they are going to let someone else's cruelty be the last word. He had started to speak. He'd gotten her name out and his hands around her arms before she stepped back, not away from him, but back into herself, into a self that had already begun the process of closing certain doors. "Did you know?" she had asked. Not accusatory. Worse than accusatory. Genuinely asking. Because she had needed to know, and she had trusted him enough to still believe an honest answer was possible. "No," he had said. "I swear to you, no." She had looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he had thought, had genuinely believed, that she was going to stay. that she was going to let him fix it. Then his father appeared in the doorway and said his name. One word. In the voice Maxwell Pierce used when he was reminding Donovan of the full weight of the Pierce name and everything attached to it. And Donovan had turned his head for 2 seconds. 2 seconds of reflex, of a lifetime of conditioned response to that voice. When he turned back, she was already walking. He had gone after her. He had been stopped, physically, a hand on his arm that he'd had to work against, by his father, who had stood in that doorway like a wall and said things that Donovan had never repeated to anyone because they were the kind of things that, once spoken aloud, cannot be made to exist only in the past. The cab had been called from inside. She'd had her coat. She was prepared to leave, which meant some part of her had already considered it before she walked into that hallway. That was the detail that still returned to him at unexpected moments, that she'd had her coat. He had spent years trying to find her. He had found her finally on a staff directory attached to a business transaction. He had sat across a conference table from her and watched her not recognize him. He had stood on a terrace and listened to the man she was going to marry threaten him with legal delays to keep him quiet. And somewhere, in that night 12 years ago, in a hallway he had not been standing in, his father had said something to the woman carrying his children that Donovan still did not know the full content of. Maxwell Pierce had never told him, and Amara had never come back to finish the sentence that the sound of his father's voice had interrupted. That unanswered question was the thing that everything else had grown around. What exactly had Maxwell said to her in that hallway? And was it the same thing he still wasn't saying now? The photograph on Sienna's phone had been sitting in a folder she'd labeled Dad's Study for 3 weeks before she showed it to Mara. She hadn't meant to wait that long. She'd told herself initially that she was waiting for the right moment, but the truth, which she admitted to herself somewhere around day 10, was that she was afraid of what Mara would do with the information. Mara felt things at full speed and acted at the same pace. Sienna preferred to have a map before she started walking. By the time she finally turned her phone screen toward her twin across the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, she had already spent those 3 weeks doing what she did best, researching quietly and methodically the way she approached every problem that mattered to her. It had started simply enough. She'd run a reverse image search on the photograph, cropped to show only the woman's face, nothing that might identify the house or location. No direct results. She'd expected that. The image was old enough and private enough that it wasn't likely to exist anywhere indexed. So she'd gone sideways instead. She knew 3 things from the photograph: the woman's approximate age, the rough time period of the image based on the clothing and print quality, and the fact that she shared specific physical features with both herself and Mara. She also knew, from years of quiet observation, that her father's silence had a particular shape. It wasn't the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who had decided, at some fixed point, that certain things would not be discussed. She started with her father's professional history. Leonard Cross had moved them to this city when the twins were 6. Before that, the address on record, she'd found it on an old alumni directory from his graduate program, was in a different state entirely. She cross-referenced the address with local records, found nothing immediately useful, and widened the search to include his name alongside common social contexts, charity events, faculty listings, professional associations. On the 14th day, she found a photograph in the archived social pages of a regional newspaper, a charity gala, 11 years ago. Her father was in the background, slightly out of focus, standing near a group of men she didn't recognize. She almost missed him. What she didn't miss, what pulled her eyes back to the image before she'd fully registered why, was the woman standing 2 people to his left. Different dress, different setting. Older than the study photograph by what looked like a year or 2, but the same face. The caption listed 12 names in the photograph. The woman was identified as Amara Jennings, legal associate, attending on behalf of a firm Sienna had to look up separately. She had a name. Mara took one look at the screen and said, "That's us," with the flat certainty of someone identifying a color. "I know," Sienna said. "She's alive." "I know," Mara put the phone down on the table. She was quiet for almost a full minute, which for Mara was extraordinary. Then she said, "Dad told us she died." He hadn't said it exactly like that. He had never used the word died, Sienna realized, now that she was thinking about it carefully. He had said their mother was gone. He had said she wasn't coming back. He had answered every subsequent question with a grief so convincing that neither of them had ever thought to press past it into the specific language of what gone actually meant. He said she wasn't coming back, Sienna corrected quietly. Mara looked at her. That's worse. Sienna pulled the phone back and opened the next thing she'd found, because she hadn't stopped at the newspaper archive. Amara Jennings had a professional profile on a legal directory, current as of 8 months ago. Senior Legal Counsel, Langston Media Group. And 3 days ago, in a social column covering a high-profile engagement party, there was a photograph of the Langston estate terrace, guests arranged in the background. Sienna had enlarged it 4 times before she was certain. Near the left edge of the frame, in a deep green dress, laughing at something someone had said, the same woman, older now, composed, with a ring on her left hand that caught the light. "She's getting married," Mara said, reading over her shoulder. "She's engaged," Sienna said, "to someone named Cade Langston." Mara was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice had the particular flatness that meant she was working very hard to keep it steady. "Does she know we exist?" Sienna didn't answer, because she didn't know. And not knowing was worse than either answer would have been. They sat with that for a long time. The kitchen was the same as it always was, the same overhead light, with the slightly dimmer left bulb their father kept forgetting to replace, the same fruit bowl with one aging orange in it, the same view of the back garden through the window above the sink. Everything exactly as it had been this morning, before this conversation, before the name Amara Jennings had become something real rather than a hole in the shape of a person. "We have to contact her," Mara said. Sienna had known this was coming. She'd been knowing it since day 14, when she found the name in the caption. She'd been resisting it, not because she didn't want to, but because she'd been running the alternative outcomes in her head, and every version of it included the possibility that made her throat tighten. What if Amara Jennings knew exactly where her daughters were, and had chosen, every day for 17 years, not to reach out? "She might not want to see us," Sienna said. Mara picked up the phone and looked at the engagement party photograph one more time, at the woman in the green dress, laughing, at the ring, at the life that appeared from this single frame to be full and complete and entirely assembled without them. "Then she can tell us that herself," Mara said. "But she doesn't get to not know we're asking." Sienna took the phone back. She looked at the screen for a moment. Then she opened a new document and typed, at the top of a blank page, the words, "Dear Ms. Jennings." Imagine being 17 years old and realizing the story of your own life has been missing a chapter the whole time, and then deciding, despite everything, to go looking for it anyway. The envelope arrived at Langston Media's legal department on a Wednesday, addressed by hand in the kind of careful, deliberate print that suggested the writer had rewritten it at least once. It was routed to Amara's assistant, who placed it in the morning correspondence stack without particular attention, between a contract amendment notice and a scheduling request from an outside firm. Amara found it at 9:20, after the first 2 items in the stack had been dealt with. She almost set it aside. Handwritten correspondence to her professional address was unusual enough to make her cautious. Instead, she opened it. It was 4 paragraphs, single-sided. The handwriting inside was slightly different from the envelope, still careful, but less formal, as if the writer had relaxed fractionally once past the first line. "Dear Ms. Jennings, my name is Sienna Cross. I'm 17 years old. I have a twin sister named Mara. We were raised by our father, Dr. Leonard Cross, in a house where certain questions were never fully answered, specifically, any question that began with the word mother. 3 weeks ago, I found a photograph in my father's study. I have spent those 3 weeks trying to understand what I was looking at. I believe, and I want to be clear that I am asking, not accusing, that you may be our mother. I have included copies of 2 photographs for your reference. I understand if this letter is unexpected or unwelcome, or both. My sister and I are not looking for anything other than the truth. If we are wrong, we would like to know that. If we are right, we would very much like to talk. You can reach me at the number below. I will understand if you choose not to use it. Sienna Cross. Amara, read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk, pushed her chair back slightly, and looked at the 2 photographs the girl had included. One was a copy of something old, black and white, slightly overexposed on the left edge. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. The woman in the photograph looked like her. Not approximately, not as a loose resemblance, like her, specifically, in the way a mirror is specific. The second photograph was of 2 teenage girls sitting at a kitchen table. They were not identical quite. One had a slightly sharper jaw, one held her shoulders differently, but they shared something in the structure of their faces that was immediately apparent. Something in the eyes, something in the particular asymmetry of their mouths. Amara picked up the letter again and read the 3rd paragraph once more. I believe, and I want to be clear that I am asking, not accusing, that you may be our mother. She had no memory of a pregnancy. She had no memory of children. She had a medical history that included a serious accident 12 years ago, a car crash, head trauma, a period of unconsciousness, followed by a slow, incomplete recovery that had left certain years before the accident as largely blank territory. Her doctors had been consistent, and she had learned to be consistent with them. Some memories don't return. The brain protects itself. You build forward. She had built forward. She had built Amara Jennings, senior legal counsel from whatever had come before, and she had not spent significant energy on the before, because the before was mostly silence. But the girl in this photograph had her eyes, and her sister had her jaw. She called the number at the bottom of the letter at 11:30 from her office with the door closed. Sienna answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Mara joined it halfway through, her voice carrying the particular directness of someone who has decided that being gentle takes too long. Sienna walked her through the research, the newspaper archive, the professional directory, the engagement party photograph. Amara listened to all of it without interrupting, because she had learned over years of legal work that listening completely before responding was almost always the correct approach. When Sienna finished, there was a silence. I don't have memories of the time before my accident, Amara said carefully. I need you to understand that. I'm not dismissing what you're telling me. I'm telling you that I have no way of confirming it from my own experience. We know, Sienna said. That's part of what we want to talk to you about. In person, if you're willing. Amara looked at the 2 photographs still on her desk. At the woman, who looked like her. At the girls, who looked like her daughters. Yes, she said. I'm willing. She set the phone down after the call ended and sat very still for a moment. Then, without entirely meaning to, she thought about Cade. About the merger he had brought to her attention 8 months ago. About Pierce Holdings. About the name Donovan Pierce, which had appeared in her professional materials for weeks now, with the mundane regularity of a business contact. She thought about the fact that Cade had known, for as long as she had known him, that she had a gap in her past. That he had heard her describe it, she had told him, early in their relationship, in the tentative way she discussed it with anyone she let close enough to need to know. She thought about how carefully he had listened, how gently he had told her it didn't matter that she was who she was now. She thought, he listens carefully to everything. And then she thought, for the first time, a question she had never previously had reason to ask. What exactly does Cade Langston know about who I was before the accident? She didn't yet have an answer, but the question, once formed, did not go away. Have you ever had a moment where something small, a letter, a phone call, a single question, suddenly made everything you thought you knew look completely different? Keep watching. The cafe Sienna had chosen was on a side street in Greenwich, the kind of place that had been there long enough to have regulars who came for the coffee rather than the aesthetic. 6 tables inside, 4 on the pavement outside, a chalkboard menu above the counter with the day's specials written in someone's unpracticed cursive. It was, as Sienna had intended, entirely neutral ground, not too formal to feel like an interview, not too casual to feel unserious. Amara arrived 5 minutes early and sat with her back to the wall, facing the door. Old habit, her therapist had once observed, from a time she couldn't remember, the instinct to see who was coming before they saw her. She recognized them the moment they walked in, not from the kitchen table photograph Sienna had sent, from something more immediate and harder to account for. The particular way they moved into a room, a slight wariness, offset by deliberate composure. Sienna came first, 1 step ahead, taking in the room before the door had fully swung open. Mara came in beside her, already scanning, and then landed on Amara's face and stopped moving for a half-second before continuing forward. They were taller than she'd expected. Mara wore her hair down. Sienna had hers pulled back. Both of them were looking at her with an expression she recognized because she had worn it herself, in mirrors, when looking at something she needed to understand before she could respond to it. They ordered coffee. All 3 of them. It gave them something to do with their hands. "Thank you for coming," Sienna said, once they'd settled. "Thank you for writing," Amara said. She meant it. Whatever was true or not true about the situation, the letter had taken courage. The specific, quiet courage of someone who has prepared themselves to be wrong and is going anyway. Mara looked at her, directly across the table. "You look like us," she said. Not unkindly, just observationally, in the way of someone who prefers to name what's in the room. "I noticed that," Amara said. "Does it feel strange?" Mara asked. "Yes," Amara said. "Does it feel strange for you?" Mara considered it. "It feels like finding the cover of a book we've been reading without it." Sienna pulled out her phone and her notebook. She had a notebook, Amara noticed, with tabs. Color-coded tabs. The organizational impulse was so familiar, it produced a brief, disorienting recognition that had nothing to do with memory. "We want to tell you what we know," Sienna said. "About our father, about the research, about everything. And we'd like to know what you're able to tell us. We're not here to make demands." "I know," Amara said. "Start from the beginning." They did. Sienna narrated, methodically. Mara added details with the frank precision of someone who has already processed the emotional weight of the information and is now reporting it. Their father, Leonard Cross, who Amara had no memory of, though she had a faint, unplaceable association with the name that she couldn't locate in anything concrete. His career as an academic, the way they'd moved when the twins were 6, the photograph in the study. Then, Donovan Pierce. Sienna said the name carefully, watching Amara's face. Amara kept hers neutral, though the name registered, not as a memory exactly, but in the strange way that certain sounds sometimes do, landing with a weight disproportionate to their apparent meaning. Like a word in a language you studied once, and mostly forgot. Sienna explained what she'd pieced together, the connection between their father and the Pierce family, the timeline of events 12 years ago. The fact that Donovan Pierce was the man on the other side of the merger currently absorbing most of Amara's professional attention. Mara said, "He's our father." The cafe continued around them, the sound of the espresso machine, a conversation at the counter, someone's chair scraping on the tile floor. Amara heard all of it very clearly. "He's been looking for you," Sienna said. For 12 years. He didn't know. We don't think he knew about us until recently. Amara looked down at her coffee cup, then up. You said your father, Leonard Cross, told you your mother was gone. He never said dead, Sienna said. We used to think that was just how he said it. Now we think he was being precise. Hope lived in that sentence, Amara thought, and something devastating underneath it, because if Leonard Cross had known the whole time where she was and what had happened, then the silence he'd built the girl's childhood around was not protective. It was a cage built out of someone else's choice. I had an accident, Amara said. 12 years ago. A car crash. I had significant head trauma, and I lost most of my memories from before it. I've been told I may never fully recover them. She paused. I'm telling you this because I want to be honest with you about what I can and can't give you. I have no memory of a pregnancy. I have no memory of you. I have no memory of the life that apparently existed before I became the person sitting in this cafe. Mara was quiet. For the second time since Sienna had described as extraordinary, she was simply quiet. But you came, Sienna said. I came, Amara said. She looked at them, at Mara's jaw, at Sienna's eyes, at the expressions that kept catching her off guard because they were, in small, unexpected ways, the most familiar faces she had encountered in 12 years of building herself from scratch. Then she asked the question that had been sitting with her since the phone call 2 days ago, the one that had grown steadily heavier the longer she'd carried it. Does Cade know? She said. About any of this? About you? About the connection to Donovan Pierce? Does he know? Sienna and Mara exchanged a look. It lasted 1 second, maybe 2. The kind of look that has a full conversation inside it. We think, Sienna said carefully, that he might know quite a lot. Amara set her coffee cup down. She thought about Cade's careful listening, his gentle deflections whenever she mentioned the gap in her past, the way the merger had arrived in her professional life, as if it were simply the next logical thing, when logic had very little to do with what was apparently sitting underneath it. She thought, he knows, and she understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with recovered memory, and everything to do with the 12 years of building herself that she'd done since the accident. She understood that this was not the understanding of someone who had come to information by accident. This was the understanding of someone who had chosen it, deliberately, from the beginning. There are moments when everything you thought was solid starts to shift beneath you, not all at once, but piece by piece, until you realize the ground you've been standing on was never what you thought it was. Don't go anywhere. She waited until she knew Cade would be in a board meeting. His office on the executive floor of the Langston Media Building had a view of the city that she had always found slightly performative, too deliberate, too composed. The kind of view that a certain kind of person arranges to communicate something about themselves. She had mentioned that once, early in their relationship, and he had laughed and said she was probably right. She had taken that as self-awareness. She was currently reconsidering. His assistant was at lunch. The office was unlocked. It was always unlocked during business hours, a point Cade made occasionally about transparency. She thought about that word now as she pushed the door open. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She didn't know what she expected to find, only that the question Sienna had carefully planted 3 days ago, we think he might know quite a lot, had been growing since then into something she could no longer manage around. If she was wrong, she would deal with having come in here without invitation. If she was right, she needed to know before she spent another evening in a life that might be built on a foundation she hadn't been permitted to inspect. The filing cabinet behind his desk was locked. She hadn't expected otherwise. But the cabinet itself was a lateral unit with a combination lock that Cade had shown her months ago, in the casual manner of someone demonstrating openness. She had filed the combination the way she filed most things, not in writing, but precisely in her memory. It opened on the second try. The third drawer held what she found. It was not a single item. It was a collection, organized in the way that Cade organized everything, which was to say completely. labeled folders, chronological within each label. The first folder carried her name, her full name, Amara Jennings, and inside it was a document she recognized immediately as a professional background check. Thorough, the kind commissioned from a specialist rather than a standard HR vendor. Dated 18 months before she had joined Langston Media. 18 months. She had joined Langston Media 14 months ago. She put the folder down and opened the next one. This one held printed pages from what looked like a private investigator's report. Not one commissioned recently, but one that referenced materials from multiple years. Someone had tracked her movements across the 12 years since the accident. Addresses, employment records, a photograph. She didn't remember being taken outside a legal firm in North Carolina that she had worked at for 8 months before a professional opportunity had moved her to a different city. She stood in the middle of Cade's office with the afternoon light coming through the performative view and understood that she was not reading research. She was reading a map. Someone had spent years drawing a map of her, and the man who was supposed to marry her had acquired that map before they had ever met. She heard the door. Cade came in without rushing, which told her he'd been told, his assistant, most likely, who had clearly returned from lunch. He took in the open cabinet, the folders in her hands and her face, in that order. He closed the door behind him. He did not try to explain the cabinet. He did not offer the kind of immediate, reflexive denial that guilty people reach for when they need time to construct something better. He crossed the room, sat down in the chair across from his own desk, the visitor's chair, which she noticed, and looked at her with an expression that was, as always, composed. "How long?" she asked. "Before you came to Langston Media," he said. "I knew before you arrived." "You arranged it," she said. "Not a question." "I created the conditions," he said. "The position was genuine. Your qualifications were genuine. Nothing about your work here has been manufactured." "Cade." Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "The merger. Pierce Holdings." A pause. Small, but present. "Yes." "You knew Donovan Pierce was connected to my past." "Yes." "You knew about the twins." Something shifted in his face. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a person who has been holding a position for a long time and can feel the ground beneath it beginning to give. "Yes." She set the folders down on his desk. Her hands were level. She was aware of how level they were, and of the effort it was not costing her, which told her something about how far past shock she had already traveled in the 3 days since Greenwich. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular quality of someone choosing words from a very limited supply of honest ones. "Because I found you before he did," he said. "And I made a decision." "A decision about my life," she said, "without me." "You didn't have a past to make decisions about," he said. "I was trying to give you something stable before." "Before what?" she said. "Before I found out that the life I'd built was inside a story you were writing." He had no answer for that. She hadn't expected one. She looked at him for a moment, at the face she had trusted, at the man who had listened so carefully and so consistently, and with such specific attention to the particular shape of her gaps. She thought about what it meant to be known thoroughly by someone who had acquired that knowledge before you'd consented to sharing it. She reached up with her right hand, crossed it over to her left, and removed the ring. She set it on the desk beside the folders, not with force, not with drama. Just set it down. The way you set something down when you've understood it no longer belongs to you. "What would you do?" she said quietly, "if the person you loved had been making your choices since before you met them?" She didn't wait for him to answer. She picked up her bag and walked to the door. "What would you do if you discovered the person you trusted most had known the truth about your life the whole time and said nothing?" That question doesn't have an easy answer, and neither does this story. Keep watching. She called Donovan from the car. It was not an easy call to make, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she was calling a person she had no memory of. to tell. Him that she believed she had once loved him, based on the account of two teenagers and a filing cabinet full of documents she hadn't been supposed to find. She was aware of how that sounded. She made the call anyway. He answered on the third ring. He said her name, not her full name, just Amara, in the specific way a person says a name they have been saying internally for a very long time. She said, "I know who you are." There was a silence. "How much do you know?" he asked. "Enough to have questions," she said, "and I'd rather ask them in person." He gave her an address in Connecticut. She drove out the following afternoon, a Saturday, gray and cold, the kind of November weather that made the countryside look like something someone had painted before they'd finished deciding how it should feel. The estate was not what she'd expected, which she'd realized on the drive was because she'd been unconsciously preparing for something like the Langston property, the kind of place built to impress. This was different. Large, certainly, but settled, the way a house looks when it has been lived in genuinely rather than maintained professionally. Donovan met her at the door. She had been in the same room as him 3 times since the merger began, and each time she had processed him as a professional contact, capable, measured, containing something she couldn't quite categorize, but had attributed to the general interpersonal complexity of significant business negotiations. Standing in the doorway of his house on a Saturday afternoon, she understood that what she had been categorizing incorrectly was grief. He had been sitting across conference tables from the woman he had spent 12 years trying to find, maintaining professional distance, and what she had registered as restrained intensity was the effort that cost him. He showed her into a sitting room with a fire going and 2 cups of tea already on the table, which told her he had put thought into this. They sat across from each other, and he began from the beginning. He told her about a charity gala 11 years before her accident. A conversation that started over a dispute about the canapes. She was apparently unimpressed. He had found this immediately compelling. He told her about the 2 years that followed, how they had kept it quiet. Compelling. He told her about the 2 years that followed, how they had kept it quiet initially. Not from shame, but from the particular privacy of something that feels too real to share too early. How she had been working at a firm then, building toward partnership, with the focused energy he had found both admirable and occasionally maddening because it left very little room for spontaneity. He told it carefully, without sentimentality. He gave her facts and scenes rather than declarations. The restaurant where they went for her birthday, the specific argument they'd had about his father's involvement in his professional decisions, the afternoon she had told him she thought they should be honest with the people in their lives about the relationship. He told it the way a person tells a true story, with the natural interruptions of someone finding the right word, with the small hesitations of someone deciding how much detail is useful and how much is just for him. "The pregnancy," she said, when he reached that part of the timeline. He paused. "You found out 4 days before the gala. You were trying to find the right moment to tell me. You hadn't yet. And your father. He intercepted you in the hallway." His jaw tightened slightly. Involuntary. Quickly controlled. "What he said to you in that hallway, I only know partially. You told me some of it in the 15 minutes we had on the terrace before." He stopped. Began again. "He offered you money to leave. He told you I was already committed to another engagement, which I wasn't, not voluntarily. He made clear that the alternative to accepting his terms was something he had both the means and the intention to execute. He threatened me," she said. "Yes." The word came out flat and certain, the way people say things they have had a long time to be sure of. "And you didn't know." "Not until you told me on the terrace. I came out looking for you, and found you 12 minutes after he'd already." He set his tea down. 12 minutes. She thought about the coat. Sienna's research had included the detail. She'd had her coat ready, which meant some part of her had been considering departure before Maxwell Pierce had said a word. She thought about what that meant, that the threat had confirmed a fear she'd already been carrying, and that confirmation had been enough. "I'm not looking for an apology," she said. "I need you to understand that. I'm not here because I think you owe me something." "I know," he said. "I'm not offering one. I'm offering the truth, which is what you came for." She looked at him across the firelit room, at the man who had described 2 years of her life, in precise, unembellished detail. At the specific quality of his restraint, the effort it cost him to tell this story without allowing it to become a petition. "You said you don't want anything," he said. "I want you to know that I mean the same thing. I'm not asking you to return to something you don't remember. I'm not asking for anything, actually. He stopped. "I needed you to have the true version, whatever you do with it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November light was failing, the gray sky dropping toward dark. "I want to remember," she said finally. "Not as a declaration, more as a discovery. The way you say something aloud and understand it's true only once you've heard it in your own voice. I don't know if that's possible, but I want to try." He nodded once. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. What she did not say, because she didn't yet know how to say it, was that sitting in this room felt less like meeting a stranger and more like returning to a frequency she had been out of range of for a very long time. That his voice, telling her the story of her own life, had produced something in her that was not quite recognition, but was not entirely unlike it. That she suspected, with the careful caution of someone who has learned the hard way that suspicion is not the same as knowledge, that recovering her memory might not be the most important thing she needed to do. Building something forward might be, Mara declared, within 4 minutes of arriving at the Connecticut estate, that the kitchen was the only room she was interested in. This was partly her standard method of making herself at home in unfamiliar spaces. She moved toward the practical, the useful, the specific, as a way of bypassing the larger emotional weather of a situation. It was also, Sienna suspected, because the kitchen was warm and smelled like something good, and they had driven 2 hours and not had lunch. Donovan, to his credit, did not treat the moment with the fragile reverence that could have made it unbearable. He had made soup, a specific decision, Amara noted, for a meal that was neither formal enough to be an occasion nor casual enough to suggest he hadn't thought about it. The table was set for 4. There was bread. Mara picked up a piece immediately, without asking, which seemed to please him in a way he kept off his face with only partial success. They sat down. The first 10 minutes were, by general unspoken agreement, about the soup. "Its quality. Good," Mara confirmed, with the authority of someone who cooked and expected others to take the assessment seriously. "Its ingredients," Donovan explained without being asked, which meant he'd anticipated the question, which meant he'd been thinking about how this meal would go. Sienna asked about the bread. "A bakery in town," he said. Mara said he should learn to make it himself. He said he had tried once, and the result had been used as a doorstop. Mara said that wasn't a reason to stop. Amara sat at the corner of the table, where she could see all 3 of them, and watched the first genuinely light moment she had experienced in 6 days settle over the room like something deciding to stay. After the soup, Sienna produced her notebook. Mara made a sound that was not quite a groan. "She has notes," Mara told Donovan. "I have questions," Sienna corrected. "She has questions arranged by category with color-coded tabs," Mara said. Donovan looked at the notebook. He looked at Sienna. Something in his face shifted. Small, private, quickly managed. "Ask," he said. Sienna asked, with the organized, specific thoroughness that she apparently applied to everything. She asked about the early years, how he had managed work and the twins and the investigation simultaneously, and he answered without self-congratulation, as if it had simply been the next thing that needed doing. She asked about Leonard Cross, and why he had agreed to raise the girls, and Donovan's answer was slower and more careful. He had trusted Leonard, had believed the arrangement was temporary, had not understood, until much later, the full extent of what Leonard had been part of. Mara, who had been listening with apparent disinterest while methodically working through a second piece of bread, said, "Did you like him?" "Leonard Cross." "Yes," Donovan said. "Then, I've had to revise that." Mara nodded. "We had to revise it too." It was the most direct thing anyone had said all evening about the shared weight they were all sitting inside. And it was exactly right. Specific enough to be honest. Brief enough not to require anyone to perform a response. Amara looked at Mara with the particular appreciation you have for someone who knows when the precise word is better than the carefully constructed sentence. The photograph albums came out after dinner. Sienna had brought 2 physical prints, the kind that required deliberate effort to produce and keep. She set the first one on the table and opened it without preamble. Amara turned pages. There were the twins at approximately 2, a bath time photograph, both of them indignant about something. Mara with an expression of concentrated outrage that was completely recognizable from the face sitting across the table. There were the twins at 5, at a beach Amara didn't recognize, Sienna holding a bucket with the seriousness of a person on a formal assignment. There was a birthday photograph where Mara had apparently decided that cutting the cake was taking too long and had addressed the situation directly with both hands. There was a school photograph from what looked like 4th grade where Sienna's collar was perfectly straight and Mara's was inside out. That was deliberate, Mara said, pointing at the collar. It was not, Sienna said. It absolutely was. You didn't even notice until the photo came back. I noticed, Mara said serenely. Amara turned another page. A Christmas photograph, the girls around 10, both in matching pajamas that they had clearly negotiated separate relationships with. Sienna's were neat. Mara's had the sleeves pushed up and the bottoms rolled. Behind them, barely in frame, was Donovan, caught in the act of carrying something, unposed, looking at them with an expression that the camera had caught without his knowledge. It was the expression of someone watching 2 people who are the reason he does most things. She looked at that photograph for a moment longer than the others. He always hated having his picture taken, Mara said, watching her. So we made it a game. Whoever caught him in a photo without him noticing got to pick the movie for the next month. I won that game significantly more than she did, Sienna said. You cheated, Mara said. I was strategic, Sienna said. Donovan said. From his end of the table, I was aware of the game the entire time. Both girls looked at him. You let us think we were catching you? Sienna said. Some of the photos came out well, he said simply. Amara closed the album slowly. She thought about the word family, how it was a word that usually arrived with history already attached. With the accumulation of ordinary moments that you don't understand are building something until you look back and see the shape of what they've made. She had no access to the history in these photographs. She couldn't claim the bath time or the birthday or the beach. But she was sitting at this table, and the girls across from her had driven 2 hours because they had written a letter to a stranger, and the stranger had come. I want to know them, she said. She said it to Donovan, because it needed to be said to someone who would understand the full weight of what it meant coming from her. I don't know how yet, but I want to, Mara said. Good. Because I have opinions about your current apartment, and I've been waiting for an appropriate moment to share them. Sienna put her head in her hands. And for the first time in 6 days, in what felt, honestly, like significantly longer, Amara laughed. Sometimes family isn't about recovering what was lost. Sometimes it's about building something from whatever you have in front of you. And sometimes that turns out to be enough. The guest room at the Connecticut estate was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a hallway lined with bookshelves that someone had filled without any apparent organizational principle, novels next to architectural references, next to what appeared to be an entire shelf of cookbooks that had clearly been used. She had noticed the hallway on the way to bed. She noticed things like that. She woke at 3 in the morning, not from a nightmare, from the particular sharp alertness that sometimes arrived without warning and left her lying in the dark with her eyes open and her thoughts running faster than she had given them permission to. This had happened since the accident. Her neurologist had a clinical name for it and several suggestions, most of which she'd tried with partial success. She lay still for a few minutes. The house was quiet in the specific way of old houses, not silent, but settled, making the small sounds of a building that knows itself. She heard nothing that required attention. She was simply awake, and unlikely to become otherwise in the near future. She got up. She wasn't looking for anything. She took her water glass and walked out into the hallway, intending, vaguely, to find the kitchen, familiar ground from the evening, warm, practical. But the hallway was dark, except for the low nightlights at floor level, and she misjudged the direction, and turned right instead of left, and found herself at the far end of the hall, in front of a door that was not quite closed. She pushed it open. It was Donovan's bedroom. She knew immediately from the specific order of it, the same quality of considered arrangement she'd observed in the sitting room and the kitchen. A space organized by a person who thinks carefully about where things belong. She should have stepped back. She was halfway through doing so when she saw the painting. It was on the wall opposite the window. Large, not enormous, oil on canvas, in a frame that was good without being ornate. It was a portrait. A woman, seated, turned slightly toward a window that the painting implied rather than depicted. The light in the painting fell across her face, and her shoulders with the quality of afternoon rather than morning. She was not posed, or rather she was posed, but in the way of someone who has forgotten they're being watched, and the painter had clearly understood that was the better picture. Amara stood in the doorway of Donovan Pierce's bedroom at 3 in the morning, and looked at a painting of herself. Not a photograph, not a sketch, a full portrait, oil paint, rendered with the attention of someone who had commissioned it as a permanent thing. The woman in the painting had her eyes, her jaw, the particular way she held her shoulders when she thought she was unobserved. She was wearing something dark red, and she was looking toward the implied window, and the expression on her face was one that Amara had never seen in any mirror, or perhaps could not remember seeing, open and unguarded and entirely present. "I had it done from photographs," Donovan said. She hadn't heard him in the hallway. He was standing a few feet behind her, in the doorway, dressed with the rumpled practicality of someone who has learned to sleep light. His voice was quiet, and contained no apology for the painting. He said it the way you state a fact you have already made peace with. "When?" she asked. Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. 7 years ago, he said. "There was a period, around year 5 of looking, where I accepted that I might not find you. I didn't want to lose the specifics, the way you looked when you weren't paying attention to how you looked." She kept her eyes on the painting. "That sounds like something that would be difficult to explain to someone else in your life." "It was," he said, simply, without self-pity. She looked at the woman in the portrait, at the open, unguarded expression. She tried, carefully, without forcing it, the way her therapist had always told her to approach it, to find something in herself that corresponded to it. Not a full memory, just a correspondence, a texture, anything. What she found was not a memory. It was something more like a direction, the sense that the painting was oriented toward something she would recognize if she could get close enough. "Tell me something else," she said. "Something small, not the important things. Something ordinary." He was quiet for a moment. "You made coffee the same way every morning," he said. "Exactly 4 minutes French press, then you'd forget it while it was still too hot and drink it cold 20 minutes later. Every time. I bought you a thermos. You used it twice." She closed her eyes. She tried to locate that. The weight of a French press. Cold coffee. The specific mild frustration of a thermos that has been provided as a solution to a problem you are apparently attached to maintaining. Nothing specific. But the direction, again, the sense of something just past the edge of her current range. "I'd like to try," she said, carefully. I'm not saying I know what this is, or what it can be, but I don't want to walk back out of this house tomorrow and return to managing this from a distance." "Careful works," he said. "Careful is what I have." She turned away from the painting finally and looked at him. At the restraint it had cost him to stand in that doorway and state facts without petitioning for anything. At the quality of patience that had apparently sustained 12 years of filing cabinets and dead ends and parking lot photographs. "Some of it may never come back," she said. "The crash itself. Certain periods. My doctors have been consistent about that." "I know," he said. I'm not who I was, she said. I've built something different. I don't know that I'd trade it, even if I could. I'm not asking for who you were, he said. I don't know who that would be for, at this point. Certainly not for me. She nodded once. Outside the window, the Connecticut dark was the specific thick kind that cities don't produce, absolute and genuinely quiet. She thought about the painting, and the thermos, and the cold coffee. She thought about Sienna's color-coded notebook and Mara's collar and the Christmas photograph where Donovan hadn't known he was being watched. She thought, there is a life here. It is not the life that was taken from me, but it is in the same country. Good night, she said. Good night, he said. She walked back down the hallway, past the bookshelves with their unsystematic contents, and found the kitchen this time, and stood in it for a few minutes in the dark. Then she went back to the guest room and slept, solidly, until morning. Some things don't come back all at once. Some things come back the way light does, gradually, from a direction you weren't expecting. Stay with us. Marcus Webb had been with Pierce Holdings for 11 years, which meant he had been with Donovan Pierce for 11 years, which in practical terms meant he had developed, through proximity and accumulated context, a fairly precise understanding of when his employer was carrying something significant and when he was simply busy. He had been watching Donovan carry something significant since the morning of the first Langston media meeting. When Amara called him directly, she'd gotten his number from Donovan, who had offered it with the brief explanation that Marcus was the person to speak to about the investigation. Marcus drove out to Connecticut on a Tuesday morning and sat down with her in the library with a laptop and a physical file that he'd been maintaining, in one form or another, for 8 of the 11 years he'd worked at Pierce Holdings. He was a compact, methodical man who said less than he knew, which Amara recognized as a professional quality she respected. He set up without preamble and began from where Donovan's search had ended the previous year. What he had was substantial. He'd spent the 6 months since Donovan had found Amara's name in the Langston staff directory, doing what he described as filling the gaps in a file I'd always known was incomplete. He had, through contacts he declined to specify precisely, obtained records that told a more complete story of the night of the accident than either Donovan or Amara had previously had access to. The car crash 12 years ago was not disputed as an accident. The road conditions were genuinely poor, the visibility was genuinely limited, and the physical evidence at the scene was consistent with a vehicle losing control on a wet surface. What Marcus had found was not evidence that the crash had been deliberately caused. What he had found was evidence of what happened immediately before it. Amara had left the Pierce estate in a cab. The cab had taken her to a hotel, not her own apartment, which told Marcus she'd been cautious about going somewhere predictable. She had checked in under a name that wasn't hers, using a method of payment that suggested she'd prepared for the possibility of needing to be difficult to locate. She'd called one person from the hotel room that night, Leonard Cross. He was already in contact with Maxwell Pierce, Marcus said. He said it without particular inflection, which she had come to understand was his version of care. We don't know the full content of the arrangement. We know there was a financial transfer from a holding company connected to Maxwell Pierce to a personal account registered to Dr. Leonard Cross, dated 3 weeks after the crash. Amara was quiet. We also know, Marcus continued, that the crash occurred on a route from the hotel toward the airport. She had purchased a ticket under her own name for a flight departing that morning. The crash happened 20 minutes from the airport. She thought about that. About the person she apparently was 12 years ago, who had spent a night in a hotel room under a different name, and then gotten up in the morning and bought a flight. Who had been leaving, not panicked, but prepared. Who had arranged her exit with the methodical caution of someone who understood the situation they were in. And Cade? She said. Marcus opened a second section of the file. Cade Langston made contact with a private investigator named Hartwell approximately 22 months ago. Hartwell had previously been retained, on 3 separate occasions, by Maxwell Pierce. He let that land before continuing. Hartwell's report, which we obtained through a separate source, includes a comprehensive history of your movements and employment since the accident. It also includes documentation of the twins' location and Donovan's ongoing search. She said, Cade bought the file. He acquired comprehensive access to it. Yes, Marcus said. She thought about the filing cabinet, about the folder with her name on it, and the date 18 months before she joined Langston Media. There's one more thing, Marcus said. He turned the laptop to face her. The video was security footage, the kind that exists at private events more often than guests realize, sourced from the estate's own system. The timestamp put it at the Langston engagement party. The angle was from high on the terrace, looking down at the east corner, where the guests thinned out near the garden wall. She watched Donovan standing with his back to the stone railing. She watched Cade approach. She could not hear the audio. The footage was without sound. But she had been there, at the other end of the terrace, and she had no difficulty reading the body language of what she was watching. Cade's contained, deliberate posture. Donovan's stillness. The moment when Donovan set his glass down. She watched Cade deliver an ultimatum she couldn't hear, in a body language she understood completely. She watched Donovan look across the terrace toward her, toward the woman in the green dress who had been laughing without knowing she was being protected from a truth she had a right to. She closed the laptop herself. Maxwell Pierce, she said, is he. He died 14 months ago, Marcus said. Cardiac event. He had been in declining health for several years. She thought about the hallway at the Pierce estate, about the conversation she had no memory of, in which a man she had never consciously recalled had apparently said enough to send her out into a rainy night with her coat already on, about the fact that whatever the full content of that conversation had been, the person who'd had it with her was no longer available to answer for it. Some of it we'll never know, she said. No, Marcus agreed. Some of it we won't. She sat back. She looked at the ceiling of the library for a moment, at the shelves that ran up to the crown molding, at the particular quality of a room that has been used for thinking. Donovan's house, she was increasingly understanding, was full of rooms built for use, rather than appearance. He tried to destroy me, she said, not with heat, with the flat, clear tone of someone stating a conclusion they've had time to arrive at properly. Maxwell Pierce. And Cade spent 3 years making sure I never found out. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. She picked up her phone. There was one more conversation that needed to happen before she could begin moving in any direction with any confidence. And she already knew what she was going to say. The truth doesn't always arrive the way you expect it to. Sometimes it's a security tape. Sometimes it's a file in a cabinet you weren't supposed to find. And sometimes it's the date stamp on a financial transfer that tells you everything you needed to know. Don't go anywhere. She chose a neutral location this time. Not his office, not a restaurant with an audience, a private meeting room at a hotel in the city, the kind of room that businesses use for conversations that require discretion without formality. She arrived first. She sat facing the door. He came in looking like himself, composed, well-dressed, carrying the quality of self-possession that she had once found reassuring and now understood differently. He sat down across from her without being invited to, which was, she thought, still very him. I've spoken to Marcus Webb, she said. He received that without visible reaction. I expected you would. Then, you know, I have a reasonably complete picture. Reasonably complete, he said. Not entirely. Tell me what's missing, she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had none of the careful management she was used to from him. Or rather, it still had the management. But underneath it, she could hear something that she thought might be genuine. I found your file through Hartwell, he said. Maxwell Pierce had paid for years of surveillance on you. When Maxwell died, Hartwell's firm released the file commercially. It wasn't legal, but it happened. I bought it. He paused. Not because I was pursuing you. I wasn't. I bought it because I recognized your name from something Maxwell Pierce had said years before at an industry dinner. He was drunk and uncharacteristically indiscreet. He mentioned a woman his son had been involved with. He was not kind about it. And you decided what to do with that information, she said. I decided to find you, he said, to understand what I was dealing with, to see I don't know how to say this without it sounding worse than it was, to see what the situation actually was, before determining whether it was something I needed to manage. And then you met me. Something moved across his face. The expression of a man arriving, in real time, at the part of the story he doesn't have a defensible version of. And then I met you, he said, and I made a choice that I've spent 3 years telling myself was the right one. Was it protecting me? She asked. Or was it controlling the situation? He met her eyes. Both, he said. I think if I'm honest, it started as the second and became the first. I did love you. I do. He said it without urgency, without the pressure of someone trying to use it as an argument. That isn't a defense. I know that. It isn't, she said. I kept Donovan away from you because I genuinely believed, that reintroducing that history into your life before you were stable enough to manage it would cause damage I'd be responsible for. He folded his hands on the table. I was wrong. Not about the care, about the right to make that decision for you. She looked at him for a moment. At the face she had trusted for 3 years. At the man who had, in his own way, loved her, in the particular controlling way of someone who conflates protection with possession and has never fully understood the difference. You should have told me, she said, from the beginning. Whatever you thought the consequences would be, I had the right to know. Yes, he said. There was no qualification around it. Just yes. The murder, she said. Was it always about bringing Donovan into my orbit? Was that the point? He was quiet for a second too long, which was, itself, the answer. Cade, she said. I wanted to see what would happen, he said, between the two of you, in a controlled setting. I thought, if she sees him, and there's nothing there, then we continue. If there's something, then I have my answer too. And you were prepared to use the merger as leverage to keep him quiet, if necessary, she said. He didn't deny it. She hadn't expected him to. She looked at her hands, flat on the table. The left one, bare since the day she'd put the ring down on his desk. She had thought, in the days since, that she might feel something complicated about this conversation. Grief, perhaps. Or the specific grief of realizing that something you'd built was constructed on different ground than you'd believed. What she felt instead was clarity. The clean, slightly vertiginous feeling of a person who has finally found the actual floor after a long time misjudging where it was. I think you did love me, she said. I think that's true. And I think love is not sufficient reason for what you chose. He nodded. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, slightly smaller than he was. Not diminished, exactly, just human-scaled. The composed, deliberate architecture of him was still there, but she could see through it now to the person who had made a series of calculated choices and was currently sitting with the weight of all of them at once. What happens now? He asked. Now I rebuild, she said, alone. And then, carefully, with the people I choose to involve, with others. She stood. I hope at some point that you understand what the difference is between love and control. I think you're capable of it. She meant that. She left it where it was and walked out of the room. You can love someone fully and still cause them damage they didn't consent to. That's one of the hardest truths in this story, and maybe outside of it too. Keep watching. The diary had been in a box. Donovan had kept it without opening it. Part of a small collection of her things that had been at his apartment at the time of the accident, and which he had never been able to bring himself to either keep accessible or entirely put away. The box had moved with him to Connecticut when he bought the estate, and it had lived on the top shelf of the library ever since. He brought it to her without ceremony, set it on the side table next to her chair, said, "Whenever you're ready," and left the room. She sat with it closed for almost 20 minutes before she opened it. The diary was an ordinary thing. Navy cover, the kind available in any stationery shop, the kind a person buys with vague intentions and then actually uses, which is rarer than it sounds. Her handwriting inside it was unfamiliar to her in the way her own voice sounds strange on a recording. Recognizable as yours, but filtered through a medium that changes it slightly. Smaller than her current handwriting, and faster, with the occasional strike-through of someone who wrote as they thought and sometimes needed to revise mid-thought. She started from the beginning. Then she stopped. Then she turned to the middle. The entries were dated, which helped. She found the period she was looking for, the months before the accident, and read slowly. She was, apparently, someone who used her diary primarily for working through problems rather than recording events. The entries from that period were less today, I did this, and more, I've been thinking about the following. And here is my attempt to think about it more carefully. She recognized that quality immediately. It was, still, how she used written notes. She read about Donovan, not by name initially, referred to as, did in the way people sometimes self-censor their own diaries out of a habit of privacy that extends even to themselves. What she read was the account of someone who had spent a considerable time being cautious about love, and was currently, with evident effort, learning to be less so. He makes it feel straightforward, one entry said. I keep waiting for the thing that makes it complicated. Maybe the thing is that there isn't one. She turned pages. She found the entry written on the day she had apparently taken the positive pregnancy test. It was short. 3 lines. I don't know what I expected to feel. I feel calm. I feel terrified. I feel like the future just arrived without knocking. That was it. 3 lines. And the date. Then, an entry, 4 days later, that was longer and harder to read. Not because of the handwriting, but because of the content she had written in careful and specific terms about the conversation with Maxwell Pierce. She had written it down while it was still fresh, still exact, while the shock of it hadn't yet blurred the details. She read every word. She read what Maxwell Pierce had said to her in the hallway of his estate, the offer, the framing of it, the thing he had said about what he was willing to do if she refused. She read, in her own words, the precise shape of the threat. She read the thing he had said at the end, the last sentence, the one that had apparently been the weight that tipped her, and she understood, finally, why she'd had her coat already on when Donovan found her on the terrace. It wasn't that she'd been planning to leave. It was that she'd known, somewhere, that Maxwell Pierce was going to create a situation from which leaving would be the only available response, and some instinct had prepared her for it before her conscious mind caught up. She closed the diary. She sat in the chair for a long time. Then she opened it again and kept reading, past the accident entries, which were sparse and factual, written in a hospital hand that was measurably different from everything before, as if the pen and the brain were operating on a new and uncertain acquaintance. Past the slow, effortful entries of the first year after the accident, when she was building herself from whatever remained. Some memories, the diary confirmed, had not returned at all. The crash itself, the actual event, was not recorded. There was an entry the evening before, and then the hospital, and the space between them was simply absent. Not described, not alluded to, blank. The brain had protected that particular thing completely, and 12 years of living forward had not changed it. Donovan came back to the library, an hour after he'd left. He didn't ask. He sat in the chair near the fireplace and she continued reading, and the room maintained the specific quiet of 2 people who have learned that silence between them doesn't require filling. Eventually, she said, I read what he said to me. Maxwell. He put his book down. All of it, she said. He was very specific. I know, he said. I read it before the box went on the shelf. Once. I should have told you. She considered that. No, she said, after a moment. I think it had to come from my own words. I think I needed it to be mine. He nodded. The crash itself, she said. I don't have it. The diary stops the evening before and picks up in the hospital. That may not change, he said. I know. She looked at the diary in her hands. There's a doctor, she said. The records from the hospital. Marcus found documentation of who attended to me when I was brought in. The same physician also has records from. She stopped. Started again. From the pregnancy. From before the accident. I'd like to find her. Her name is Dr. Chen, Donovan said. She's been practicing in the city for 20 years. Marcus already has her contact. Amara looked at him. You knew. I suspected you'd want to find her, he said. I asked Marcus to locate her. I didn't contact her. That's yours to do. She held the diary. She thought about blank spaces and what lived inside them, whether absence was the same as loss, or whether some things were simply beyond the range of what memory can hold and still keep the rest of you intact. Not all of it is coming back, she said. No, he said. I need to find a way to be at peace with that. Yes, he said. I think you will. She wasn't sure yet whether she believed him, but she thought, tentatively, that she might be beginning to. There are things we lose that don't come back, and there are things we find that we didn't know we'd lost. The question is what you choose to do with both. Stay with us, because the last part of this story is the one that matters most. The first date was Mara's idea, which meant it was not called a date and was framed, specifically, as a practical necessity. You need to see the city properly, Mara announced, appearing in the estate kitchen one Saturday morning with the decisive energy of someone who has already solved a problem and is simply informing the relevant parties. You've been in conference rooms in this house. That's not sufficient research. Amara said. Research for what? For whether you like it here, Mara said. Whether this could be home? You can't make that decision from a guest room. Donovan, at the coffee maker, said nothing. Sienna, at the table with her notebook, made a small note that might have been related to what was being said or might have been entirely unrelated. With Sienna, it was often impossible to tell in real time. So the first outing was Mara's curated tour of the city, which turned out to be a deliberately eclectic collection of places, a bookshop that had apparently been operating in the same building since before any of them were born. Bakery, that Mara assessed as nearly as good as the Connecticut one. A park with a specific bench that Mara said had the correct view, and a hardware store that Amara suspected was on the list primarily because Mara needed something from it. Donovan came. He did not organize the day. He walked beside Amara when the pavement was wide enough and slightly behind when it wasn't, and he bought her coffee from a cart near the park without asking how she took it. He already knew, and he made her laugh twice, once intentionally and once by accident, and both times felt, to Amara, like something she was very carefully not calling what it was yet. The weeks that followed were structured by an unspoken agreement to build forward, rather than backward. There were dinners at the estate, increasingly easy, as the strangeness of the four of them at a table gradually became its own familiar thing. There were evenings where Sienna sat with her in the library and asked questions about her work, genuine questions, absorptive, the way Sienna did everything, and Amara asked questions back. And Amara understood, incrementally, the shape of a girl who had been quietly building herself into someone formidable for 17 years, without anyone in her immediate environment fully appreciating it. There were afternoons with Mara that generally involved Mara having an opinion about something, and Amara gradually discovering she often shared it, which Mara received not with surprise, but with a satisfaction that suggested she had considered this likely. With Donovan, the building was slower and more deliberate, and required more care, because the stakes of it were different, and they both understood that. They took walks. The estate had grounds enough for proper walking, and they used them on weekend mornings when the weather permitted. In the way of two people who have found that motion is sometimes easier than stillness when you're saying something that requires space around it. He told her things. Not large things. Not the history she'd already received in the sitting room, but smaller things. What she had thought of a particular film they'd apparently seen together, which she had no memory of but could form an opinion of from his description. The argument they'd had once about the correct way to pack for a trip, which apparently she had won so decisively that he had capitulated on the subject entirely and never revisited it. She told him things, too, about the 12 years, about the cases that had challenged her most, and the colleagues she'd respected, and the way she'd learned to navigate the gap in her past in professional contexts. The careful, practiced shorthand she'd developed for questions about her background that deflected without lying. She'd been, she realized, telling partial truths for so long that the full version felt almost physically different in her mouth. Heavier, more room-filling. He listened to all of it without trying to find himself in it. That, she thought, was the thing she had not expected and could not have predicted. He was not listening for the version of her that had loved him. He was listening to the version of her that was here. 6 weeks in, on a Tuesday evening after dinner, they sat on the terrace in coats, because the temperature didn't warrant it, but the night was clear, and the stars were the kind that aren't available in the city. She said something about the painting in his room, something she'd been thinking about since that 3 in the morning moment, how it had been painted from photographs, from what he remembered of her, and how the face in it was hers but not quite her, because no one's past self is entirely continuous with who they are now. He said, "I know that. I've known that since the conference room." She looked at him. "And it didn't matter. It mattered that you were there," he said. "The rest I was willing to learn." The kiss, when it happened, was on a different evening, and came from a different direction than either of them had been navigating toward. She had made a joke, something dry and quick about his inability to operate the guest room window latch, and he had laughed in the specific, unguarded way of a person who is completely present, and she had been looking at him while he laughed, and it was simply the next thing, easy and unannounced and entirely without drama. It did not unlock her memory. She had not expected it to. She had, somewhere in the past weeks, released the idea that love was supposed to operate like a key, that the right feeling would restore the right past. What it felt like instead was simply itself, present, warm, its own thing, new and not contingent on any other version of itself. She decided that was enough. More than enough, actually. It was exactly sufficient. Nothing real gets built quickly, and nothing worth having arrives without the work of choosing it every day, in the small ways that don't look like choices until you look back and see what they added up to. Dr. Chen's practice was on the 4th floor of a medical building near the hospital where she had privileges, and her office looked like the office of someone who had been at this long enough to stop, trying to make it look like anything other than what it was. A room where difficult conversations happened with some regularity, and where the quality of the listening mattered more than the furniture. She was 61, small-framed, and had the particular directness of a physician who had learned over a long career that softening true things rarely serves the person being spoken to. She had agreed to meet with Amara after a brief phone call in which Amara had explained the situation plainly, and Dr. Chen had said with equal plainness that she had been wondering, for 12 years, whether this conversation would eventually happen. "You were my patient twice," she said, once they were seated, during the pregnancy and at the hospital after the accident, both times under different circumstances. She paused. "I want to tell you what I can, and be clear about what I'm legally and ethically bound to keep confidential. There are things in your medical record that belong to you, and I'll share those. There are things that involve other parties." "Maxwell Pierce," Amara said. Dr. Chen looked at her steadily. "Among others. He's been dead for 14 months, Amara said. "I don't know what that changes legally." "It changes some things," the doctor said. "Not everything." What she could confirm, the pregnancy had been straightforward, the delivery uncomplicated. The twins had been healthy at birth. Amara had been in good health. The plan, as she understood it at the time, had been for the twins to remain with their father following a private arrangement. She had not known the full circumstances of why. What she could also confirm, with the careful language of someone who has thought about the phrasing in advance, she had been contacted, in the weeks following the accident, by a representative of Maxwell Pierce's estate. She did not specify what had been discussed. She said, with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of disclosure, "I made decisions in that period that I have reconsidered many times over the years since." Amara absorbed that. She did not press for the specific content of what had been discussed, because she understood that pressing would not get her there, and that the statement itself was, in the language of someone who had spent considerable time managing its weight, a form of acknowledgement. The crash, Amara said. Was there anything? It was consistent with a road accident, Dr. Chen said. I have no information suggesting otherwise. Amara nodded. She had expected that. She had not expected the investigation to conclude cleanly, but she had needed to ask. What I think you're really asking, Dr. Chen said, with the directness of someone who has been listening to the question underneath the question, is whether there's anything about your medical history from before the accident that might help with memory recovery. Yes, Amara said. The answer is, not significantly. The doctor's voice was steady. The type of memory loss you experienced is well documented in severe head trauma cases. Some things return over time. Some don't. The most significant predictor of what does return is not medical intervention. It's a stable, low-stress environment with meaningful emotional connections. The research on this has been fairly consistent. She paused. You appear, from what you've described, to be in the process of creating that environment. I'm trying, Amara said. That's the right answer, Dr. Chen said. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a conversation that has reached its boundary, the place where what can be given has been given, and what remains is what the person has to carry out on their own. There are things I'll never know, Amara said. Yes, Dr. Chen said. Probably. The crash itself. Certain months before it. Whatever Maxwell Pierce said in full to bring me to the decision I made that night. Likely, yes. Amara looked at her hands. She thought about the diary and the blank space between the evening before the accident and the hospital. She thought about the things she'd found, the things Marcus had found, the things the diary had given back, the things Donovan had carried for 12 years in a filing cabinet and a painting, and the specific knowledge of how she took her coffee. She had enough. Not everything, but enough to understand what had happened, enough to understand what had been done to her and why, enough to understand who had been lost and who had been found, and what the difference was between those two categories. Justice, she had understood for some time, was not going to arrive in a clean and satisfying form. Maxwell Pierce was dead. The representative who had spoken to Dr. Chen would remain unspecified. Leonard Cross, who had kept her daughters and cashed the transfer and said, "Your mother is gone," without using the word dead. She had not yet decided what she wanted to do about Leonard Cross. That conversation existed somewhere in the near future, and she was not ready for it yet. And she had given herself permission to not be ready. What she was ready for was the next thing. The actual next thing. The one she was walking toward rather than the ones she was still sorting through. She thanked Dr. Chen. She shook her hand. She walked out of the building into the afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment, her coat on, her hands in her pockets, the city doing what cities do around her. Then she took her phone out and called Donovan. Not for any particular reason, just because she wanted to. He picked up on the second ring. How did it go? He said. She confirmed what we needed, she said. Some things I'll never know. Are you all right? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions that deserved a real answer. Yes, she said. I think I actually am. Not every story ends with every question answered. Sometimes what you get is enough truth to build on, and the wisdom to understand that this is not a consolation prize. It is, in fact, the whole thing. She told the twins on a Sunday. It was not planned exactly, or rather, it was planned in the way that Amara planned things now, which was with intention but without a script. She had arrived at the estate the previous evening for what had become a regular weekend arrangement, and the four of them had had dinner, and Mara had made an argument about the correct way to fold napkins that had somehow extended 20 minutes past any reasonable scope, and Sienna had won a board game with a quiet, comprehensive thoroughness that suggested she had been planning her strategy since approximately round 2. In the morning, after breakfast, she asked them to sit with her in the garden. It was cold, but clear, the early spring still deciding what it was. They sat on the stone bench near the far wall, Sienna on her right, Mara on her left, which felt, she thought, like the correct arrangement. She could see the house from there, and the library window, and a corner of the terrace where, weeks ago, Donovan had stood with his back to the railing and listened to Cade threaten him with legal delays in order to protect her from a truth she had a right to. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. Mara said, "You're staying." Amara looked at her. "I haven't said that yet." "You brought your own coffee this morning," Mara said. "Not from the estate supply. Yours. Which means you're planning for more than a weekend," Sienna said, with the mild exasperation of someone who has spent 17 years adjacent to this. "You could let her tell us." "She's telling us," Mara said. "I'm just also telling her that we already know." Amara looked at Sienna. Sienna gave her a small, apologetic shrug that contained the clear message. This is simply how she is, and it has been for 17 years, and we have all reached a state of functional acceptance. "I want to move here," Amara said, "permanently. I've spoken to my firm about a transition. There are options that would let me continue most of my work remotely, with occasional travel. The legal work on the Pierce Holdings acquisition will be complete in 3 weeks, at which point my professional obligations to Langston Media formally end." She paused. "I'm not moving in because I've recovered my memory. I haven't, not entirely, and I may not. I'm moving in because I've made a choice about where I want to be. With both of you. With—" She stopped. Started again. "I'd like to be here." Mara was quiet. For the third time in Amara's experience, she was beginning to understand that Mara's silences were in inverse proportion to the significance of what was being said. She was simply quiet. Sienna, beside her, said, "We'd like that." "I won't get everything right," Amara said. "I need you to know that. I don't have the history. I don't have the context for things you grew up with. There will be gaps, and I'll probably miss things I should know, and I'm asking for patience with that." "We grew up with gaps, too," Sienna said. "We know how to navigate them." Mara, who had been looking at the garden wall, said, "Are you going to call us Mara and Sienna, or are you going to do that thing where you add the other word?" "What other word?" Amara said. "Mara," Mara said, demonstrating with a particular tone that was clearly an impression of something she'd heard other people do. "And Sienna." Same tone. "The thing where you say our names like they're a full sentence." Amara considered this. "I think I'll probably do both," she said, "depending on the situation." Mara appeared to find this acceptable. "Fine," she said. "But if you're going to do the full sentence version, at least wait until I've actually done something to warrant it." "Noted," Amara said. She looked at them, both of them, the specific and irreducible people they had become in 17 years of growing up with a father who answered certain questions with silence and a gap where their mother should have been. At Sienna's quiet, organized, ferociously competent approach to everything. At Mara's direct, warm, thoroughly opinionated presence in every room she occupied. At the particular combination of familiarity and discovery that she suspected would keep producing new understanding for a long time. Donovan appeared at the terrace door. He had, she noted, given them the morning. He held up a coffee cup in a gesture of inquiry. She held up 3 fingers. He nodded and went back inside. "He practiced that," Mara said. "The natural timing. He's been checking the window every 20 minutes. Amara said, "How do you know that?" "I timed him," Mara said. Sienna said, "That's not something you needed to share." "It was going to come out eventually," Mara said serenely. "I prefer to manage the timeline." The garden wall was covered, along its upper edge, with the beginning of something, a climbing plant, still mostly bare this early in the year, with the first tentative suggestion of green at the joints where branch met stone. It would be full by June, she thought. She would be here to see it. All right, Amara said. She stood up from the stone bench. Let's go inside. They did. Some choices aren't made at a dramatic moment. They're made quietly, on a cold bench in a garden, when you realize that the life in front of you is better than anything you'd thought to plan for. And then you simply choose it. The Pierce Foundation Gala was held every November, as it had been for the past 8 years. Same hotel ballroom, same format, the same string quartet that Donovan had hired once and then continued to hire, because nobody had a compelling argument against them. The cause was medical research funding, specifically neurological, a specialization that had not been accidental. Amara stood at the podium in the kind of room she'd been in many times now, dressed, assembled, comfortable with the particular attention of an audience that is listening because the person speaking has earned it. She had given talks before, professionally, at legal conferences, at industry events. This was different. This was the Pierce Foundation, which meant the cause was personal, and the room included people who knew the full story, and people who knew parts of it, and people who knew only the polished outline that appeared in public records. She was the wife of Donovan Pierce, and she had been in a car accident 12 years ago, and she had rebuilt her life, and here she was. All of that was true. None of it was complete. 12 years ago, she began, I woke up in a hospital with a name I was told was mine, a face I recognized in the mirror, and very little else. She paused. The room was quiet in the way of rooms that are listening specifically. What I had, instead of memory, was the capacity to build forward. I didn't know at the time that this was enough. I spent a considerable period believing it wasn't. She looked out at the room, at the tables with their white cloths, and the people at them, and the specific collection of faces she could read from where she stood. Mara, at the table nearest the left of the stage, was watching her with the focused attention she gave to things she cared about, which she disguised, as usual, with a posture of mild disinterest that was entirely unconvincing to anyone who knew her. She was 20 years old now, and in her second year of a law degree that she was, by all accounts, handling with the same direct, comprehensive thoroughness she applied to everything. Sienna sat beside her, because they were still usually beside each other, and Sienna's notebook was, inevitably, somewhere on the table. She had moved into her own apartment the previous year and come home every second weekend and cooked dinner, with a competence that had surprised everyone except herself. Donovan was at the same table. He was watching her the way he watched things he considered worth watching, fully, without distraction, present the way he had learned to be present with her, not anticipating, not trying to predict where she was going, simply there for wherever she arrived. At a table toward the back, partly in shadow, present, because he had been invited, which had taken time and several separate conversations, and the particular kind of grace that can only come from a person who has genuinely thought about what they owe and decided to pay it, was Cade Langston. He was talking to the person beside him. He looked well. She had spoken to him twice in the past year, in conversations that were not comfortable and were not easy, and did not resolve anything so much as acknowledge it. They were, if she was honest about what the word required and what it allowed, something in the general direction of friends. It would probably take a few more years, to be sure. What I want to say tonight, she continued at the podium, is not that I found my way back. I didn't, not exactly. The person I was before the accident is not the person standing here, and I've stopped trying to close that distance. What I did find, over 3 years of very careful and very imperfect building, is something I didn't know I was looking for. She paused again. A family. Not recovered, not returned. Built by people who chose to build it, including 2 young women who wrote a letter to a stranger and meant every word of it. Mara looked at the table for a moment. Sienna pressed her lips together briefly. These were, Amara had learned, their respective versions of the same thing. Resilience, she said, is a word that gets used as if it means returning to the shape you were before the pressure. I don't think that's what it means. I think resilience is becoming, becoming something that can contain both what you lost and what you found, and not require the two things to resolve into each other. She looked at Donovan for a second. He held her gaze. I think that's the work. And I think for those of us lucky enough to have people willing to do that work alongside us, I think that's the whole story. The applause started before she'd fully stepped back from the microphone. Later, much later, after the room had thinned, and the quartet had packed their instruments, and the hotel staff were reorganizing the tables with the practiced efficiency of people who do this 40 times a year, the four of them stood in the lobby, waiting for the car. Mara said, "That was good." The speech. "Thank you," Amara said. "The line about resilience was technically the strongest point," Sienna said, which was the highest praise Sienna reliably offered. "The thing about the letter was slightly sentimental," Mara said. "It was the most applauded section," Sienna said. "That doesn't mean it wasn't slightly sentimental," Donovan said to Amara, quietly, beside her. "You were good." She leaned her shoulder, briefly, against his. "I had good material." Outside, the November night had the specific cold clarity of the kind of weather that makes a city look like itself. Clean-edged, exact, lit from below by its own busy light. They walked out into it, the four of them, and the car was there, and they got in. On the drive back to Connecticut, Mara fell asleep within 12 minutes, which was her consistent position on long drives regardless of what time it was. Sienna read something on her phone, one earbud in, the other out, also consistent. Donovan drove, which he preferred, and Amara sat in the passenger seat and looked at the road ahead and the dark on either side of it. She thought about a photograph in a leather-bound book on a study shelf. She thought about a cab pulling away in the rain. She thought about a woman she no longer was, carrying a coat and a decision she hadn't finished making. She thought about the blank space in the diary, and the painting, and the cold coffee, and a letter that had begun, "Dear Ms. Jennings," and changed everything. She thought, "I didn't find my way back. I found something better." And sometimes, not always, not automatically, not without considerable cost and work, and the willingness to choose forward even when forward is unfamiliar, sometimes that is the greatest love story of all. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, if it made you think about the people you've chosen and the people who chose you, share it with someone. And if you want more stories like this one, you know where to find us.